Caroline, and thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. Not only to share your wisdom and messaging with us, but also to be in the space of kind of co-learning and solidarity building, I think, today, which is really necessary. So my name is Renee Bourgeois. I'm the Executive Director at the John Humphrey Centre for Peace and Human Rights. The Centre is a legacy of John Humphrey, who was the principal drafter of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. He's a Canadian lawyer, so we're part of his legacy. And we're a non-partisan charitable organization based here in Edmonton. But we're working kind of across the province, but also across the country, really to advance human rights and peace building through education, training, collaboration, and dialogue. So in recognition of international human rights laws, we want to ground ourselves in remembering how our human rights are deeply connected to the spaces we exist within, the spaces we take up every day, and who has access and who does not. So I want to acknowledge this place. We're upon here, the place that many of us call home, Misquechiwaskahaigan, otherwise known as Beaver Hills House or Edmonton. This land has a history that lives beyond and before us and has deeply impacted the realities that we live within today. To do human rights work is first to acknowledge this history, the past of our ancestors, and a past that has been based on genocide and erasure. And this is an acknowledgement that not all voices are heard, and we must make commitment every day to engage and learn and decolonize. So we must acknowledge the history of law in Canada and how it has evolved, and also how it is founded within an ideology of erasure through policies of displacement, removal, and criminalization. This continues to pervade our systems and requires vigilant efforts to use international human rights laws to shift and seek accountability, which we try to do at the John Humphrey Centre. So our system of law enforcement is deeply connected to our history of criminalization, and we must keep this in mind as we reflect on the stories that we're going to hear today. Issues around accountability and policing have been forefront at the Centre, at the John Humphrey Centre since about 2018. As an organization, we can tend to be a place of last resort for people who are really struggling with complex problems and human rights issues and are falling through the cracks. And as a result, we've worked to build Stride Advocacy, which is a program with a force of volunteers who can support the documentation and filing of human rights complaints, as well as a coalition of agencies that come together to engage in systemic advocacy on issues that emerge in our work, and policing has been consistently front and center in that. So through Stride, we have had increasing numbers of community members coming forward with concerns around policing, particularly those that are Indigenous, Black, live with disability, and are unhoused in our community. From lack of investigation on homicides to targeted harassment to excessive use of force, we have become more and more frustrated with our lack of ability to seek remedy and find answers and hold anyone in law enforcement accountable. The mechanisms we have to address police misconduct are inherently biased towards the policing as they're internally run. And having been through these processes with colleagues, I can attest their lack of support to the victim and how they miss the mark in finding justice and facilitating meaningful change. So when we use the human rights mechanisms, we go up against a system that can throw heavy legal resources behind their defense. This is leaving us in a space where impunity seems to be the norm when it comes to seeking remedy of police misconduct. So especially when folks who are marginalized not only do not have the financial capacity to seek justice through the courts, but also do not necessarily have the support systems or the mental, emotional, or spiritual capacity to go against the systems. We need independent and civilian-based mechanisms for police accountability. No matter what your race, your religion, your class, your neighborhood, we all want and deserve to feel safe in our community. Community should be a space where we can all belong, thrive, and achieve our full potential. We want to know that no one is above the law and that we can trust the systems of accountability and oversight that exist to protect us. For too long, and for too many, this has just not been the case. And police legitimacy is only possible when community has the trust of the police. The police build trust by being procedurally just, that is, by treating the public fairly and with respect. When the police do not appear to be taking public concerns seriously, especially involving allegations of serious brutality or lethal force, it damages the faith and trust in our police force. And when people don't trust the police, they won't call the police, they won't obey the police, and they won't cooperate with the police. And other officers are undermined when the tone set at the top does not treat serious concerns with the utmost of seriousness. So this harms the ability of police to keep everybody safe. And our hope is that by attending this tour, you'll be able to honor those who have been and continue to be harmed, and have greater agency in our own lives and our own works to hold police accountable. It's not to be said that the great majority of police officers and police interactions are legitimate and justifiable. Police misconduct is a stain that impacts officers who join the ranks for the right reasons and are committed to doing the good work. They too are victims of police misconduct, as they don't feel they have the ability to report their colleagues without sanction or retribution against them or their careers. We want to create a culture where if you can see something, you must and can safely say something. We want to see misconduct treated seriously by police service, the chief, the provincial government, via the Police Act. This has not been the case, and the time is now. Let's share with each other today in respect and reciprocity, expand each of our awareness, as well as build on our ideas for a strengthened effort of accountability. Thank you so much.
Has been home to Indigenous trees for countless generations. They have nurtured and protected this land, passing down their traditions, language, and cultures from one generation to the next. We are here to pay our respects to their enduring connection to this land and to recognize the historical and ongoing contributions of Indigenous people to the shared communities. In the spirit of acknowledgement, I am delighted to introduce Indigenous Outreach. I'm a remarkable organization dedicated to bridging the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities. I'm proud to say that I'm one of the co-founders of Tuau, and I want to share with you the visions and missions that drive our work. Tuau, which means the sun in several Indigenous languages, represents the light and warmth that Indigenous cultures bring to our diverse society. Organizations was born out of a deep commitment to reconciliation, understanding, and collaboration. I firmly believe that the acknowledgement of the past, respecting Indigenous traditions, and working together, we can build a brighter future for all. The Tuau Indigenous Outreach mission is therefore, first, we aim to foster cultural appreciation. Indigenous cultures are rich and diverse, offering unique perspectives on life, the environment, community through workshops, events, and educational programs. We strive to help individuals from all backgrounds learn and appreciate the wisdom and creative in Indigenous cultures. Second, we are committed to education. Knowledge is a powerful tool for breaking down barriers and dispelling stereotypes. Tuau Indigenous Outreach collaborates with institutions and community organizations to provide accurate and meaningful information in Indigenous history, rights, and contemporary issues. We believe that informed society is more an inclusive one. Lastly, we focus on empowerment. Indigenous communities have faced significant challenges throughout history, and they continue to do so today. By working together and supporting initiatives led by Indigenous people, we aim to improve individuals and communities to overcome these challenges and achieve the full potential. We actively seek partnership and opportunity that promote economic development, health, and well-being for Indigenous people. As one of the co-founders of Tuau Indigenous Outreach, I am humbled by the education and dedication and passion of our team and the communities we work with. Our journey has just begun, and we invite all of you to join us with our path towards reconciliation and understanding. Together we can ensure that the sun and hope and unity shines brightly for generations to come. Thank you for your time and for you listening to me and being part of this important journey. As one of the co-founders, my experiences led me here from being homeless and being addicted. I found myself being involved in a lot of negative behavior, and in doing so, I went down the wrong path with a lot of wrong people. But I would like this opportunity to acknowledge my other partner, Michelle. Well,
do I just go? Okay. I'm Rochelle. Sorry. I'm also co-founder of Tuau Outreach Collective. So like Bryce said, we're a grassroots outreach organization. We're dedicated to Indigenous harm reduction and advocating for social justice. Currently Currently, I'm a third-year student taking Indigenous social work. My educational history revolves around correctional services, which reflects my earlier dreams of pursuing a career in law enforcement, particularly Edmonton Police Services. My work experience has gone from working in the security sector, working alongside police officers, and moving on to emergency shelters. I once aspired to a career in policing, and it was during my time working in security and alongside police officers and later in my studies of correctional services, that I came face to face with a really harsh truth. I witnessed the evidence of how Indigenous people are disproportionately treated, poorly incarcerated, and trapped in cycles of poverty and socioeconomic disparities. The data and ongoing research efforts have brought to light the intergenerational trauma that runs through Indigenous communities, including my own. It's disheartening to see more Indigenous people being negatively impacted by police approaches. I'm a mother, and I fear what the future holds for my First Nations child when the statistics are so bleak. Throughout my journey, I've also had the privilege of working alongside individuals who have had the right values, right mindsets for the work that policing entails, who have also been deferred from policing. And it's brought into perspective to me that many officers who get through to the other side of policing often are ones with mindsets that shouldn't be there. It's often made me question why the ones who should be there aren't there and were deferred. Policing throughout my life was often glamorized with the promises of job security and benefits, but it was always disheartening to witness people being mistreated and harassed by officers. Throughout my work in security, I've worked alongside police officers in healthcare settings, and thinking I could help make a difference, I've realized quickly that harm reduction doesn't necessarily exist in policing or in law enforcement or even in security. And to me, the value of property wasn't as much as the value of life. Unfortunately, the core issues of police and enforcement mentality lack a lot of cultural competency, and systemic racism persists. I don't believe it's just a matter of a few bad apples. I think that we know some officers engage in racism, and that the system often turns a blind eye. There's a huge lack of accountability for discriminatory and even violent conduct, especially when it targets Indigenous people. I've seen this systemic racism firsthand, both during my professional work experience and in my educational experience with correctional services, learning about the justice system. I think it's essential that we acknowledge that the root causes of social issues aren't substance use, but colonial violence and systemic racism. Harm reduction taught me that substance use isn't the cause of crime or violence. It's a correlation rather than a causation. In pursuing education in Indigenous social work, I learned the values of harm reduction, and I was often inspired by educators like Derek Chuka, learning the importance of not staying silent, learning the importance of speaking up against injustice, whereas my efforts to pursue policing taught me to remain silent. Learning from trauma-informed justice professionals like Myrna McCallum, who hosts the Trauma-Informed Lawyer podcast, has really opened my eyes to the reality that toxic social justice exists, and it's clear that systemic racism is deeply ingrained in policing policies, and the lack of accountability and transparency perpetuates these issues. I realize that the absence of a moral compass within many officers continues on even today. We must acknowledge that the existence of problematic systemic racism and racial biases within the system in order to address them effectively. It's unfortunate to me that our current mayor has previously made statements that deny the existence of systemic racism in Edmonton Police Services when the data and evidence shows otherwise. systemic racism needs to be recognized and challenged. And with Indigenous harm reduction, we're able to see the ethical framework to address systemic racism and harmful policies, especially towards marginalized communities. And I couldn't help people in the way that I wanted to through enforcement careers, which is why I turned to Indigenous social work. Now working in harm reduction, it grants us the opportunity to challenge oppressive systems and align our actions with our core values. I believe there's space for everybody, and everybody deserves to heal and be treated with dignity. For many Indigenous people, these lands are our home. That's why we say nobody's homeless, we're unhoused. My journey has been one of realization, transformation, and the pursuit of a more just and equitable society. And we have to come together in this decolonizing work to confront these issues and work together towards a safer society. Thank you.
It's been a garbage.
Thanks for having me. My name is Dan Jones. I'm the Chair of Justice Studies at Northwest College. I'm both humbled and a little bit angry that I'm here today. I spent 25 years in policing. I'm proud of a lot of things I've done, and I'm proud of a lot of people I worked with. That being said, policing needs a massive change. There needs to be massive reform. We're talking about police legitimacy here, but we're also talking about legal cynicism. When the Crown decides not to lay charges after charges are recommended in the case like Casey Dumas, that puts the whole system under question. We have systemic racism, we have all of these things that occur, and we have a training method in policing that teaches us that everyone that we interact with is a threat. How do you be compassionate with a threat? And then the other thing is our biology tells us that if someone doesn't look like us, they're a double threat. And all of a sudden we become excessive in our violence because we are afraid. We need to change the way policing is trained. We need to change the way we hire in policing. And we need to reform policing from the top and the bottom down and up. And we also need to change the justice system. It's ridiculous that after the inception of the Gladue decision, we've seen a 53% increase in the incarceration of Indigenous people in this country. That's after the inception of a Gladue decision that was supposed to mitigate that. When you start to look at crime and you start to look at violence and you start to look at what's going on in our world, and we look at all of these things and we start to deal with these with the justice hammer, we're wrong. This isn't a justice issue, this is a health issue. When you start to look at the research that I was fortunate to be part of with the University of Alberta Prison Project, where we look at 97% of women incarcerated in Western Canadian prisons, both federally and provincially, and 95% of men are all victims of trauma. And I get the argument when I do this presentation into police groups or justice groups saying, well, of course they are. They live lives of violence and all of those things. And I say, well, it's sad that 83 and 85% of these victimizations occurred at the average age of 9, as these individuals were children. We're talking about average childhood experiences. We're talking about symptomatic criminality. Crime is a symptom of trauma, and we have done this wrong the entire time. We need to start looking at policing with the trauma-informed lens. We need to start looking at policing and justice from a public health perspective, because the social determinants of crime and the social determinants of health are almost identical. And when we deal with this with the justice hammer, we're doing it wrong, and we're continuously harming individuals, and we're creating them and putting them in situations that's going to make them more harmful. We take individuals and we incarcerate them with the idea that they're going to somehow get better without any real assistance inside those federal and provincial correctional facilities. There's nothing there in there that's going to work with somebody, and anyone who's never spent any time in a jail, I can tell you, you can't heal in a cell. You can't heal in a place that doesn't allow you to sleep at night, because there's always lights on. And there's a lot of research that shows when you don't have the proper sleep, you're going to continuously suffer. We continuously, in the justice system, we have an adversarial system. We look at it's an us versus them mentality. We need to start going back and looking at this as a community mentality. From a personal perspective, I want to just share a story. And it's the story of what policing gave me. Policing gave me trauma, and my own trauma that I've had to deal with through therapy, which is something no one ever told me was going to happen, that I was going to leave policing in a different way than I got there. But one of the greatest gifts policing gave me is a whole bunch of people that I'm connected with, a whole bunch of individuals that I'm connected with that don't happen to ever have a uniform on. They actually used to have handcuffs on. And I'm going to just share a specific story, and I think this story is just a story of hope and how we can change the way we do things. In 2005, I was in gang unit, and I ran a wiretap on a young lady. I arrested her for conspiracy to commit murder. She was involved in a street gang, and she was heavily involved in crime and violence. But I listened to two different people on this wiretap. I listened to a young lady who was involved in gangs and violence, and I listened to a young lady who was an amazing sister to her brothers, as her mom and dad both passed away when she was young. So I started to think to myself, what is it we're doing? What is my goal in this role as a police officer? What is my goal? Is to throw her in jail for the rest of her life and then make sure that she's criminalized for the rest of her life? Or is our goal to kind of try to go in and maybe make someone's life better? So I started visiting her in prison, in Remand Centre, unfortunately, where she had her first daughter and had to fight the system tooth and nail to maintain that daughter and family so that her daughter didn't go into care. And she did that. And I started going to see her, and she first told me to F off, because why would you want to talk to the cop that put you in jail? Well, fast forward several years, April 2022, I walked my oldest daughter down the aisle, and 7 days later I walked Nicole down the aisle, the young lady that I put in jail for 5 years. She calls me dad. She's an amazing mother. Her daughters and her son, her oldest daughter, who was born in jail, is on her way to graduate high school with honors and an associate's degree from college. She's already applying to master's programs in the United States. What I'm saying with that story is, I don't think police officers and us in the justice system realize the power that we have, that we can change lives by engaging, by having relationships, by being human. Myrna McCollum's was mentioned earlier today, and one of Myrna McCollum's podcast, a guy named Ian Keegan-Smith was talking about a judge, and he said she was a great judge, but she said she had this young lady before her about 21 times, and the last day that she was on the bench, she was before her, and she said, I got off the bench and I gave that young lady a hug, which is really nice. But Ian made a point, and he said, why didn't you get off the bench and give her a hug the first time? We need to be more human. We need to see people as human beings, and we need to be trauma informed in our approaches, and not just trauma informed as a tick box. Because I can tell you, one of the things that frustrates me most about policing is we tick box everything. We're going to train a tick box. We're going to be culturally competent. One day I get a training, I'm culturally competent. I'm going to train for trauma informed, but one day I'm going to be trauma informed. We make people take first aid every 2 to 3 years. 0.06% of the population in Canada has hepatitis C. 0.006% of the population has HIV. And when I wrote an article on this, 2.17% of our population had COVID-19, and we were all wearing masks. I go back to that stat I talked about earlier. 97% of women and 95% of men are experiencing trauma that are incarcerated in our jails. It's time that we take that seriously and we become trauma informed and really take it to heart, and we become compassionate, and compassion needs to be a competency in policing and justice. Thank you.
Hi all, my name is Chad Haggerty. I'm Métis. I'm from the East Prairie Métis settlement in northern Alberta. I'm currently a defense lawyer in Calgary. Prior to going to law school and graduating in 2019, I was an RCMP officer in Northern Alberta for 17 years. For 14 of those years, I worked in Indigenous communities. When I would get to the communities, it felt like home in many ways. The people were the same. My grandmother had been in residential schools. My parents had been in residential day schools. I understood the trauma that was happening. When we talk about the issues in policing, one of the things that we talk about is the need to hire different people. Well, I would suggest that I was a great hire. I understood the Indigenous communities I was living in. Here's what's never factored in. The fact that when anybody comes into police culture, they're tainted by the culture in the police organization. Never mind the fact that I understood the people that I was working with, that I could understand a little bit of Cree, that I could, their lived experience resonated with me. That didn't matter because the uniform beside me was telling me that you need to fit in with me. Never mind the community. That extended throughout police culture. A previous speaker spoke about cultural competency. There were cultural competency courses in the RCMP when I was with them. Indigenous cultural competency would be the way that it was written on the paper. How it was talked about was who's taking the Hug an Indian course this week. Because it sunk no deeper than the surface. It didn't permeate and it didn't create cultural change. That's one of the biggest problems that we have to overcome when it comes to policing. Again, prior speaker talked about the need to change from the top down and the bottom up. Well, that sounds like all of it. You cannot change bits and pieces of a horribly broken system. And when the horribly broken system is intent on continuing itself, we can talk, we can ride buses, we can make documentaries, but until the powers that be, until the governments, until the city councils, until the people rise up and force governments to foster the change, to enact the change, nothing will. Policing has been a corrupt, broken institution for a long time. And even as I say that, I have to recognize that individual police officers, like me, went in with great ideals, want to help our community. So why is it that you don't hear active police officers talking about the corruption, talking about the broken nature of the job? It's because if you lift your head up to speak out, somebody whacks you in the head. You need to trust the people around you to keep you safe because you do engage in dangerous situations. And if you speak up, you could be alone in those dangerous situations. The trauma that comes with the job is something that most people can understand. Dan Jones spoke earlier about the trauma of people in custody, and it's absolutely true. Same for police. Will the police organizations address it? They'll tell you they are. They'll check their little box and say we offered psychological services. The system is entirely broken. In Alberta, we're fortunate to have the Alberta Serious Incident Response Team overseeing police, right? It's nice to have oversight. Hold on, wait a second, don't get too excited. Who works in ASERT, the Alberta Serious Incident Response? Who works there? Ex-police officers, retired police officers. Guess what? They still have a policing mindset. The executive director of ASERT retired a little while ago, the previous one, Sue Hewson. She left. The government spun that as a planned departure. The reality, she had left, she spoke up. That wasn't a planned departure. She got sick of it and she left. The new ASERT director, Mike Ewanson, former Crown prosecutor out of Calgary. As a defense lawyer, I've dealt with him on files. He's incredibly fair, he's incredibly thoughtful. Is there evidence of that? Yes. He suggested that Ben Todd, the constable that assaulted Pacey, be charged. The Crown Prosecution Service said no. So if we have an oversight committee that's saying police officers who engage in illegal conduct ought to be charged, but a prosecution service that says no, do we have effective oversight? We sure don't. That system is just as broken as the policing system. So what to do? The first thing is things like this, standing up, saying we need change. We need to actually do something. Saying that sitting at home or getting on social media or talking to my friends and family, although those are all great starts, they're not enough. Those of us that are standing out here, that are on this bus, that are taking this action, that's fantastic. And I know we all have magnificent networks. Fostering or encouraging those networks to do a little bit more, just a little bit more. Contact the government, tell them that we need actual change. Tell them that recommendations from across the country, and specifically in Alberta, that call for police oversight and accountability to actually manifest into legislative change, that needs to happen. The Edmonton Police Commission needs to actually step up and do what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to oversee the actions of police officers. They're supposed to step in and make sure that things are being done properly. Some would say that they're doing the best that they can. I'm saying, great, do more, because it's still not enough. They need to be accountable. They need to be independent. They need to actually have the teeth to do the job they're assigned to do, which is to make sure that police officers aren't causing harm, that police officers are actually, to use the old phrase, protecting the public and fostering safer communities. When marginalized populations step out into the street and they're worried as much about the uniform as they are about anybody else, that's a horrible situation. And we can change that. We absolutely can. If we can all decide in the course of a couple of weeks, okay, maybe not all, if most of us can decide over the course of a couple of weeks to do things to protect our fellow citizens, like wearing masks, like socially distancing, like staying at home when it's best to do so, we can certainly change an organization. We can certainly change government in action. And that's all that I wanted to say. That's all that I wanted to bring to you. So, thank you.
Well, good morning. And thanks to Chad for lending me his jacket. I was freezing. Who would ever think that an ex-cop would lend me a jacket? Okay, so I've entitled my talk here, Somebody Has to Do Something. And we're all here doing something, but we need some more somebodies for sure. So I'm the chair of the Criminal Trial Lawyers Association's Policing Committee. I want to talk about the goal of the Policing Committee, the goal of the CTLA. The goal in relation to advocating for policing reform is so that we have the best possible policing for all Albertans, everybody who lives in Alberta. We don't want anything more. We're not the enemies of the police. We want the same thing that good police officers want. No good cops want to work with bad cops. Everybody agrees with that, I think. The problem is that the bad cops stay and the good cops leave. My friend down here. So the failure of police services to weed out the bad cops destroys internal morale in police services. And then, of course, it destroys the reputation of the police service in the community. The work to achieve reform and our work with the Criminal Trial Lawyers Association, the CTLA Policing Committee, it's hard, slogging work. You have to stick with it. You don't get paid a dime. And you just have to, I often think it's like banging your head against the wall. And I think if I keep banging my head against the wall, one of two things is going to happen. Either my head's going to come through the other side and we'll have reform, or I'll have permanent brain damage. Some people might think I do. Okay. So the history of our work is a standing of the committee of the CTLA. It was struck in 2000. I made the motion, it passed, therefore I became the chair, and I've been the chair ever since. I can't believe it's been 23 years. I've been the chair of the policing committee. So the need in 2000 for that was due to widespread concerns. How long were you with CPS at that time? Yeah. There were widespread concerns amongst criminal defense lawyers about EPS corruption, brutality, and violation of charter rights. I drew inspiration from a senior criminal defense lawyer. His name is William Davis. He recently passed away. And when he passed away and I heard about it, I started to think and look back in our archives about the work that he did. So, his most notable case in this area was his defense of one of 4 Chilean immigrants charged with obstruction of and assaulting police officers. That happened in 1987. So, as is often the case in these scenarios, the police version of what happened was a pack of lies. The truth was that the police officers handcuffed the accused, breaking their fingers, even tearing strips of skin off their fingers, and used other violence. The accused were acquitted, and the provincial court characterized the conduct of some 50 to 16 officers who showed up at a domestic call as brutality and a cover-up. Later, the accused sued the EPS, and it was settled with a non-disclosure agreement, which is another problem. Now that I think about non-disclosure agreements, the police hiding and extracting an NDA from people who sue them or complain in return for a settlement, and refusing to disclose to Edmontonians and the public, the rest of the public, what the deal was. Why is it a secret? That's not acceptable. Then, a private information was sworn by one or more of the accused. Guess what the Crown did? Well, the Crown stayed it, just like they did with Pacey Dumas's case. This is after a judge found there was brutality and a cover-up. The Edmonton Police Commission, to its credit, ordered a public inquiry, but it failed when the provincial government refused to fund it. That's the closest that a police commission in Alberta has got to actually holding a public inquiry, which is their power to do so. We have asked police commissions in Alberta to hold public inquiries, and they've consistently refused. Why do police commissions refuse to hold public inquiries? Then what happened was, in that case, one of them had a business. It was called the Fiesta Games Palace in downtown Edmonton. So after there was a lawsuit started, the police then targeted that business, harassing them daily, illegal searches, illegal entries, even locked everybody in the business one day and searched everybody, including the patrons. And then they claimed that these strategies were the same that they were using for other downtown Edmonton hotspots. 3 days after, so the owner said he was cooperating with the police to try to clear things up, try to establish a relationship. Then the police met with the landlord for a chat about community concerns. That was the end of the lease, and that was the end of that business. Does this sound familiar? Think about it. I don't know if you know about the story of Mo Tesfaye and the Nyala Lounge. That's exactly what the Edmonton Police Service did decades later, and it's exactly what they continue to do, including with the gang suppression team. So soon after I became chair of the policing committee, I started attending police commission meetings. I was stunned at the love-in that was going on between the police commission and the EPS brass. I was just shocked. I thought, these people are supposed to be the watchdogs for the EPS. They were just their lapdogs. So I started making a lot of noise about that. Subsequently, there was a new regime came into the Edmonton Police Commission. The chair was a lawyer by the name of Martin Ignatiuk, and he was very progressive. There was a new public complaint director, Larry Jackson, who I became friends with, and they were excellent. So they were reform-minded, and they tried to start exercising their oversight function for the police service. Now, Larry gave me a copy of Samuel Walker's book called Police Accountability, The Role of Civilian Oversight. He called it their Bible. It's an excellent book. It's been well read by me several times over, but there was one part in that book that really struck home, and it was this. One particularly skilled and aggressive attorney could make an enormous difference. Just one. So we have a number on the CTLA, on the policing committee. We need more though. So, of course, on November 18th, 2004, Ignatiuk, the chair, was targeted by certain police officers because he was their enemy, perceived as their enemy, and along with Kerry Diot, who at that time was a Sun journalist, and he was critical of certain actions by the EPS. This was known as the overtime bar scandal. If you don't know anything about it, look it up. So, what happened was there was a Sun journalist who was sitting in the newsroom with a police scanner, and he's listening to this going down, all the police radio communications going down. He phones up Kerry Diot and says, "Hey, I think they got some kind of a sting operation going down there at the overtime." So the next day, the Sun published a story about it, and the shit hit the fan. And at that time, both Ignatiuk and Diot were basically, they were afraid to make a complaint under the Police Act. So the CTLA made the complaint. About a year later, then Chief Rayner stood up at a media conference and exonerated the officers. Everything's fine, nothing to see here. But Charles Rusnell, you probably heard of him, investigative journalist at that time with the Edmonton Journal. He'd been sitting on an audio recording of all the police communications. He'd been sitting on it, waiting for this to happen, for the corrupt investigation revealed to the public. So the next day, he published the communications, and Chief Rayner was gone very quickly. I want to say something about investigative journalists like Charles Rusnell. Charles Rusnell, he's about at the retirement age. Journalism is grossly underfunded. It's a dying species, I think. Really good investigative journalism. Don't underestimate the power of the media, though. What I think is that if you can bring to the attention of the media issues about police reform, police misconduct, that's the best thing you can do. Get it out there in the public. You've got to get the public on your side. And the way to do that is through the eyes and the ears of the public, the media. They will listen to you. You establish a rapport with them, they will listen to you. I try to get my clients to talk to the media, to come forward publicly, and get that story out. It's very powerful. The only way to change policing is to make politicians think, if I don't do this, I'm going to lose votes. That's the only thing that really will affect change. So please, remember that. Then, around 2005, we had the No Rats t-shirt scandal. This is a long time ago. I'll just remind people what it was and tell people who've never heard about it what it was. There is a group of downtown police officers. They were absolute thugs in the downtown, preying on Indigenous people, the unhoused. They were terrible. And it was well known what they were doing. But then a couple of cops, good cops, said, enough, I'm going to complain about this. One was a fellow by the name of Hove, and the other one was a woman by the name of Prefontaine. they quickly became not police officers, but they raised the alarm about it. And then Charles Rusnell finds out about the No Rats t-shirts. These No Rats t-shirts were t-shirts worn at an Edmonton Police Association ball tournament. And the signal was obviously, we don't want rats in the police service. The acting chief of police, Daryl DaCosta, asked one of the officers what this meant, what this was all about. He was told what it was about, and he laughed about it. He laughed about it. The code of silence was a deeply ingrained culture within the EPS, and it's still there. So none of those cops were fired. None of them. Then in 2005, it was discovered, 2002 email was discovered that was circulating in the downtown division. It was called the racist email. And it was circulated to many police officers. It was called, titled Mr. Socko's, if you're not wrestling fans, you won't know what that means, but Mr. Socko's 10 Principles for Downtown Policing. So that story was broken by Charles Rusnell. Again, the CTLA complained about it. Again, no one was fired. So these and other lesser scandals, because they were publicized, because the CTLA was doing something about making complaints, there was a lot of pressure on the police commission to hire a chief who did not come up through the ranks and wouldn't have been part of this subculture. So, Chief Mike Boyd from the Toronto Police was hired, and basically I think he got run out of town on a rail because of pressure from the Edmonton Police Association. He was well-intentioned. I met him a few times. He wanted to make the necessary changes. In 2011, Rod Connect, another outsider, and he was a high-ranking officer in the RCMP. He was hired, and he was very well-intentioned. I formed a good relationship with him, and he recognized that we were not the enemy. He told me on a number of occasions that he really appreciated the work we were doing. He said, "You force us to up our game." And he took action on a number of disciplinary issues that his predecessors wouldn't. But he didn't last that long either. Because the police commission, I know they got pressure to not extend him and to hire another chief. And now we got Chief McPhee. And the Edmonton Police Commission should be ashamed of themselves. They got sucked in by somebody who had a bad history with the Prince Albert Police Service, a bad history as the Deputy Minister in Saskatchewan in charge of policing. They didn't do their due diligence. You can just look at the scandals now that are breaking with the Prince Albert Police Service. He was there for more than 20 years. He was their chief for 6 years. So I think it's disgraceful, and I see a lot of backsliding happening. Chief McPhee and his deputies and the brass there, they're worried about their own public image. They're not worried about actually taking action. There are some terrible pieces of misconduct that have happened within the Edmonton Police Service in the last few years, and he hasn't done anything about it except sweep it under the carpet. So, I got a few other things to say, but I've given Michael my script. I think I've probably exceeded my time limit. So that's all I have to say in my oral submissions.
Hello and assalamu alaikum everyone. My name is Trent Daly. I am the son of an RCMP officer and also a police critic in Edmonton. I've served in a variety of roles, wearing a lot of hats. I've been in the nonprofit sector for over 4 years, with a good 2 years in the Housing First program, which is a nightmare, to say the least. Harm reduction is not a priority in Alberta, unfortunately. I'd be remiss if I didn't say how important it is to have this conversation here on Treaty 6. And the significance of it isn't lost on me. I think that right now in Edmonton also we're dealing with a crisis with surveillance and policing and scapegoating affecting those supporting Palestine and those that speak up for the marginalized. I would also like to note that the work here on police accountability has been an alarm sounded by Indigenous women, Black women, and the queer community, and often those activists get unrecognized and unnamed in publications or work that is in academia. I agree with what Tom was saying earlier, that when we critique these institutions, we have to look towards the systems of accountability and leadership. The power to hire or fire the police chief rests with the police commission. And as we know, the police commission doesn't really have the same values that we do in this circle here. I don't think that the police commission holds EPS accountable, personally. You know, EPS Chief Dale McPhee is playing with the fires of political partisanship here in Alberta. He is igniting moral panics around police funding, drug poisoning, and public safety. McPhee has consistently dismissed legitimate concerns about EPS. He has used coded language to stigmatize those harmed by drug poisoning. He has even done this while people were ODing in EPS holding cells, as EPS police officers did not carry Narcan with them. McPhee is busy going to partisan fundraisers where MLAs in the UCP party dress up as T-Rexes and run, and people donate money. That's the things that he does with his free time. Chief McPhee complains about police funding that in a time, post-pandemic and during pandemic, where EPS is perhaps the only department in the city to not have their budget frozen or defunded. They got increases. And then, in contrast, the amount of money that the city spends on housing and dealing with the consequences of drug poisoning is a drop in the ocean that is police funding. EPS has been painting a picture of this fund that they don't have, the funding that they don't have, while they're cashing in on the violence in Chinatown, which is sometimes a consequence of police forces not communicating. They have advocated for operation centers in Chinatown, blocks away from their headquarters. They have tried to stoke fears and tensions around public safety with Edmonton downtown. Chief Dale McPhee is the highest paid police officer in police chief in Canada. He is demanding for more funding as Edmonton taxpayers pay the most per capita for their police for any comparable jurisdiction of this size. Now that budget is over $460 million per year. But fewer than half of EPS officers live in Edmonton or pay Edmonton taxes. Scandals like the DNA phenotyping scandal and tools that EPS uses to racially profile or have unintended consequences on innocent persons have received international criticism. And Chief Dale McPhee can't even handle the criticism on Twitter. He has stated to the Edmonton Police Commission that police are facing public criticism as a result of something that happened 1,000 miles away. Police brutality is a global issue, from Palestine to America to here, all over the world. It is an Edmonton issue too. He says it's 1,000 miles away. What about people like Pacey? That's all I have to say.
So welcome everyone. We're here with Heather Sankey and Irene Dumas and some of the Dumas family here to share their story with us. I just want to thank you both so much for taking this opportunity to share. It's an important time. So I will pass it over to you, Heather.
Hello everyone, thank you for coming out, and for Irene being willing to continue the fight that is exhausting at this point in time. Pacey was to be with us this morning. He's struggling with the anxiety of the situation. It's ongoing for the family, and we do believe, however, that the path to healing can only be through achieving justice in this case. That's an important element to the healing process. This is one of the worst cases of egregious violence by a police officer in the city of Edmonton, in circumstances that can in no way justify what was done. Pacey and his brother Blair were compliant with police who had showed up at their home on this very spot, and they followed direction at every step of the way. Blair was immediately handcuffed by the police. We're told that Pacey was not handcuffed when he was lying face down on the ground. There's no identified explanation for why they didn't immediately handcuff Pacey as well, if they did not. And the officers, according to an eyewitness standing very nearby with a bird's eye view watching everything happen, describes a scenario where one of the officers, Ben Todd, was vibrating with anger, screaming at Pacey on the ground, asking him about a knife. According to the witness, Pacey was compliant, face down, and then all of a sudden the officer just runs at him and kicks him full force in the head. We do know the results of that. Immediately went unconscious and in serious life-threatening distress, was transported to hospital, and had a section of his skull removed to save his life so that his brain could swell and heal. Part of the travesty of the situation is that Irene was inside the house with another police officer who she had warmly welcomed into the home without problem. They wanted to check and make sure there was no weapons or threat to the officers in the home, and she let them in. This event unfolded while she was in the home. When she came out to the sound of an ambulance and seeing her son's blood on the ground and neither of her sons anywhere to be seen, the police refused to tell her what had happened. They refused to tell her where he had been transported to, the condition he was in. She was told to calm down, or
they're gonna arrest me,
or they would arrest her.
Because I was going crazy out there, and they said, calm down before we charge you, arrest you.
So she's being threatened to be arrested because, like any mother, she's in agony and distress over her children. It just continues. The insult to injury after ACERT investigates highly qualified Crown prosecutors, seconded police officers, retired officers, some of whom are experts in use of force, conclude at the end of the investigation that criminal charges are warranted. Aggravated assault is what this crime is. That is one of the most serious offenses in the criminal code, one step down from murder and attempted murder. And the Crown Prosecution Service determines confidentially, under Crown privilege, that they're not going to prosecute and they're not going to tell anyone why they're making that decision, other than to continue to refer to empty statements that they never link back to any evidence, that don't make any sense to any lawyer or other person who understands the law. And they get to hide in secrecy, what I would call hiding in secrecy, because they don't have to identify who made the decision. If that wasn't insulting enough, we choose to take advantage of the private prosecution section in the criminal code, and we make the choice to bring this to a courtroom. We need to present the evidence to a judge, and the Crown steps in and again stays the prosecution before we get to the day where it was scheduled for court. It adds insult to injury. There are no words that I can express how insulting it is that even the Crown prosecutors that are making decisions on this case are married to police officers. To choose to use a prosecutor who has that direct link to the police service is brazen, in my opinion, and sends such a clear message that justice will not occur, and they're not afraid to send that message to the rest of the community. We will continue to fight for justice. We have a tremendous amount of support. The family is committed, as hard as this is on them, to take a step forward and be shot down again and again. To have their access to justice blocked repeatedly continues the anxiety and the trauma to the family, but they are committed to making sure this doesn't happen to someone else. And the only way that that is going to happen is if we all come together and ensure that there is change in the legislation. The Crown Prosecution Service has all the power to make the decisions about who is prosecuted in this city, in this province, whether citizen, civilian citizen, or police officer. There is no right of review, there is no right of appeal, and that is wrong. Especially in a case like this that is so obvious, so glaringly obvious that a crime has occurred. ACERT has recommended charges. This should be put before a court. The police officers, all of whom were involved, should be given equal opportunity to present their evidence. And if they can justify the actions, give them that opportunity to do so. The public is entitled to transparency and accountability in the police service that have a tremendous amount of power over the citizens. We're going to do our best to make sure that there is change. What would you like to say?
I don't really have nothing to say right now. It's overwhelming. Getting shot down and then trying, but we're not giving up. We have to do it. And Pacey did want to come out, but his anxiety is so bad right now. And
He was
thank
very
you guys for
upset.
supporting us.
He was very upset this morning.
Yeah.
At 6 this morning when he called and said this is a lot. This happened to him when he was 18. He's
Yeah.
20, just 21 now.
Yeah,
He's-
21.
For anyone who has kids, you're still a kid at 18, 19, 20, despite being of legal age. And he said this morning, this is a lot. I've been through a lot.
Yeah, and plus morning, he's grieving for his brother. We're having a hard time with that too. His
With
brother
the loss of
Blair,
Blair.
yeah, lost of Blair, because he was with working on a case with us, but then he passed away in March last year. And that's hard on him too. And then dealing with this, it's all hard on us every day. We're struggling. He's struggling. His siblings struggle. But
Blair really struggled
Yeah,
with the
Blair-
fact that he wasn't there, that he couldn't defend his younger brother from what happened. He witnessed it. He
Yeah.
watched it. He told us that when he was handcuffed and walking past Pacey laying on the ground when the kick happened, and he started to have a panic attack at seeing his brother lose consciousness and not knowing if he was dead or alive in that
Yeah.
moment. And he had asked the officer to open the police car door, and he couldn't breathe. And he was told to shut the F up, and there was zero appreciation or respect for the seriousness of this situation across the board. So not only the travesty of the situation, one officer's seriously bad judgment or worse, but every officer that was with the family on that day, and every person with any power in the system since then, has continued to show disrespect to this family and disregard for what has happened. What is the messaging? The most important thing, one of the most important things, is the very clear message that to police officers, that a badge and a uniform puts you above the law. There will be no repercussions for any actions taken against citizens, lawful or unlawful. It gives a green light to those so inclined to engage in bad behavior to continue to do so. Majority of police officers respect the authority they're given. They honor their uniform and the badge, and they do the best job they can. It is a few bad apples, so to speak, and the only people that can ensure that they don't have the power and authority is, number one, the chief of police, ACERT, who has been trying to do their job when they recommend charges, and the Crown Prosecution Service, the Minister of Justice, the Police Commission, all have to come together and say that those kinds of officers will no longer be tolerated in the police service, and they need to be removed from the street immediately, especially in a case as serious as this, where the evidence right from the get-go was apparent that Ben Todd was a threat to the community and should not have been allowed to continue policing after that. He did for some time.
And in this scenario, I feel like adding, like, when law enforcement officers get away with that kind of behavior, it makes it okay for other law enforcement officers. It stretches that boundary in terms of what's acceptable behavior for law enforcement. So even if you may not be a bad apple, things can shift and change over time, because the trauma, even that law enforcement officers experience, moves them into spaces that aren't healthy. And so those are things that it also impacts that way as well.
Brings down police morale, and then we hear that there are police services having trouble hiring good people, because if you had aspired in your lifetime to be a police officer, to work in the policing community, but you see what is going on and you hear that putting yourself in that kind of employment situation is going to call upon you to question your own morality. It's demoralizing to the good officers who have to stand by and watch other officers abuse their authority without consequence. It, as was said earlier today, becoming a police officer changes who you are. I was in-house counsel for the police service for a number of years, and even though I wasn't on the street, I can tell you that I witnessed the impact of change to people in uniform, and it affected me as well.
Thank you.
Can you give a thank you?
Yeah, thank you.
So, for people who don't know me, I'm Bridget Sterling. I'm a former Edmonton Public School Board trustee and now a PhD candidate at the University of Alberta. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the School Resource Officer Program and kind of what happened around that, because it's a good story. So in 2018, Bashir Mohammed, who I think is well known in circles in the city, came to the board with some pretty clear evidence that there were problems with the SRO program. And Bashir and I had talked about it before, but I thought, now I know better, that working behind the scenes was going to kind of get me there. We were in a time when it was really hard to talk about policing in this city at that time. We'd seen the van attack and death of Daniel Goodall, and those things made it really difficult. And I knew that if I put forward a motion, then it was going to fail and we wouldn't be able to talk about it for a decade. So I tried for about a year to work behind the scenes. Resulted in two things, one of which was a lunch and learn PR session for trustees with principals and school resource officers, and an invitation to lunch to the board chair with the chief of police. So there was this quiet pressure wasn't working, and most of my colleagues were still supportive of the program, unfortunately. I knew Michael and my colleague Sheila Dunn were similarly questioning, but it wasn't going to be enough votes to change anything. And I talked to young people who had been former students in Edmonton Public Schools who really talked about their experiences with the program and wanted to do something to change it, but we knew that we were going to have to do a lot of work in the community to get us there, and so I thought it was going to take us years. But in 2020, there were two things that happened that really shifted the landscape, one of which, of course, was the murder of George Floyd and sort of the revitalization of the Black Lives Matter movement and widespread questioning of policing, even by my conservative dad, who I would have never thought was going to question police. And secondly, there was a really important investigative piece done by Progress Alberta that dug up that officers who were actually pulled off the street for under investigation for violence or corruption had actually been placed in the school resource officer program while they were pulled off the streets. And so I really asked ourselves, I needed to ask ourselves, like, why were we trusting people like that with our kids? And what other community partner would we allow to continue to operate in our schools if we found out they were putting people under investigation for those kind of actions. You know, we had the officers from...
Sorry, can we open the door and let you in? And then we'll we'll redo that last sentence as the bus gets moving.
Great.
If that's okay. Sorry, grab a seat. Shima, do you want to... Do we have a seat there?
Yeah.
Or beside Paula or... And then, okay, 1 sec, sorry. Yeah, let's get going. So we'll get the bus moving and then we'll restart from where you were.
Yep, that's okay.
You have us hooked. You have us hooked, Bridget. Don't worry, we're waiting.
Okay, and action.
So we really had to ask ourselves, you know, how do we trust people like that with our kids, and what other community partner would we allow to continue to work in our schools when they were putting people with that kind of track record into school buildings? You know, we had the officers who were involved in the sweatbox incident who were placed in Edmonton Public Schools. So we had a window of opportunity now to really raise the conversation, and so I started with a formal request at Public Board to get information about the program. I thought, okay, maybe if we get this information, we can start to do something. But what I really found out was that even asking questions in public was not going to give us accountability. We had the head of the program, M. Chan, come to the board and basically almost be completely evasive in answering questions. The division admitted that they had almost no information on the program, and the police really weren't going to give us any. We also saw Chan go on an interview with CBC News and outright lie about there being regular firearms incidents in our schools. As trustees, we got reports on every single serious incident in the school. My entire time on the board, I never had a report of an incident with a firearm in an Edmonton public school. So the Edmonton Police Service also claimed they didn't have arrest data, something we later discovered was absolutely false. Thanks to Bashir and Alex DaCosta from the U of A digging up a huge amount of information on a FOIP request. They even discovered that about 20,000 students in Edmonton Public Schools have been labeled as offenders. These aren't students who'd ever been arrested or convicted of anything. They were just labeled offenders. We don't know why. This is this criminalization of youth who'd never had an interaction with the courts. So they also, you know, so Chan also claimed that the practice of dumping bad cops in the program had stopped when he took over the program in 2015. But we all know how hard it is to get information about investigations underway. So we had no way of knowing for sure, and they did not provide us any verification that that was actually the case. So we had, as a school division, no information about officers' disciplinary records, no knowledge of how many students were being criminalized, and no information on how the program was affecting students. While at the same time, money that was supposed to go into classrooms was paying for about half of police officers' salaries. And money shouldn't be what buys us accountability, but it's shocking that we're paying salaries for people what I knew very little about in a program that's refused to share even basic information with us. So it also turned out the program hadn't been reviewed in its more than 40 years of existence. I can tell you I went from K to 12 in Edmonton Public Schools. I got evaluated by the school division far more often than the SRO program did for me. The data also on SRO programs is mixed at best, and there's pretty strong evidence that it has disproportionate harms to Black, Indigenous, and Brown students, as well as sexually and gender diverse youth and students with disabilities. And so there's really, in my mind, there's no demonstrable benefit that outweighs the harm that it does to those kids. However, well, some of my colleagues also felt that we should just get rid of this program permanently. Sometimes you have to play strategy and politics. So I brought forward a motion to suspend the program and conduct a study, an independent study with university academics to really get a clear picture of it. Because I knew that at least would get them out of schools. And it was a strategy that had succeeded in the Toronto School Board when they got SROs out there. So it was sort of shown to work. But schools like police as a disciplinary tool, and there were some games that you can ask me about later played in the selection process. Ended up with a team that was seen as very favorable to SROs are still out of our schools. Michael and I managed to get through a policy change that also means that now to bring them back, the board has to have a public vote. And so that means they have to make a decision in public. And this is one of the things that I've really come to realize is if we as citizens can't hold police accountable, we need to hold the politicians who oversee those police accountable, because they like to claim there's nothing they can do, but there's actually tons that they can do, right? There's a lot of authority that they have over budgets and things like that that they can make some serious change. But those cops are still coming into schools as well. They're not entirely gone, right? They still come to schools, and they're used to circumvent young people's charter rights.
My name is Samantha LeBon, and together with Mr. Tom Engel, we are counsel for the Nguyen family. We represent the Nguyen family in their pursuit of justice after the death of Stephen Nguyen. Our aim is to shed light on this tragedy, promote the important objectives of accountability and transparency in our police service, and work towards eliminating violent and deadly use of force by police in our communities. On June 5, 2021, Constable Alex Doddick killed Stephen Nguyen right in this very spot. His family lost a son, a brother, a friend, and a father. After his death, his family was desperate for answers, and none were given. Police refused to give any information. ACERT began to investigate, but they also did not release any information. The family did not even know the name of the person who killed their son. The only reports released were that an officer had shot and killed him, and that allegedly a weapon was involved. No photos or evidence of that alleged weapon were forthcoming, and the family continued to suffer the loss of Stephen while also struggling without any information that could give them closure. We contrast this to what happens when a police officer has force used against them or anything inflicted against them. Perpetrators are immediately charged, they're immediately identified. If there's a weapon involved, the photo is immediately released to the public, released to the media, and the police separately publish it in the hopes and in the objective to show that policing is a very dangerous job and to justify their actions. The same is never distributed when the danger is the police. The family only began to learn what happened that night with Stephen after they filed their civil suit against the police, which required the police respond via statement of defense. In February 2022, 8 months after Stephen died, the family learned that Stephen did not have a weapon that night. They learned that the reason he died was because he was alleged to be brandishing a cell phone, an iPhone. There was no weapon. The devastation and grief the family experienced only worsened. We also learned the other officer who attended with Constable Doddick never unholstered his weapon. The ACERT investigation continues to churn more than 2 years later. In the course of representing Stephen's family, we've learned Constable Doddick's misconduct is not limited to the death of Stephen. On August 31, 2023, Constable Doddick was criminally charged with assault causing bodily harm and assault with a weapon for an incident where he used a baton on a man, which required him to be hospitalized back in 2019, 2 years prior to killing Stephen. But it doesn't stop there. In 2020, Constable Doddick was one of 2 officers who posed for a photo while taking a man into custody, and this photo was shared on their social media. The image showed the officers smugly smiling on both sides of a shirtless man who was quite clearly in distress and vulnerable and in handcuffs. The caption, with its flippant tone and hashtags like "Don't do drugs, kids," was shocking to the public. Worse, the social media post appeared to be condoned by the police until it was brought to the attention of the media and the scrutiny of the public eye. Despite this history, ranging from mean-spirited treatment of vulnerable people to violent conduct to deadly acts, while the investigation into Stephen's death is ongoing, Constable Doddick was promoted to acting detective. He was given an award for investigation's excellence. Shocking doesn't capture it. The fact that an officer would be promoted following a deadly use of force, while there is not 1 but 2 active ACERT investigations, is deplorable. It is difficult to see how a community could trust or have any confidence in their police service when scenarios like that are allowed to occur, with seemingly no oversight or repercussions, when the same would never be tolerated for a civilian. Why should it be tolerated for the police? This case reflects not only a quest for justice, but a fundamental reminder of the importance of police accountability, transparency, and upholding the principles of justice that are the bedrock of our society. We will fight to see this through and get accountability for Stephen and his family, and to inspire change for his and our community. Before I conclude, I just want to build a little bit off of what our last speaker talked about you know, the chief sort of saying, oh, we don't have that many deaths in our community. You know, I think we have to really be mindful that every death is a tragedy and they can't be minimized, right? We're not talking about numbers, we're talking about people, we're talking about families who experience loss, immense loss, and the communities that support them. So it's really, I can't state it enough that we have to keep this top of mind when we look at cases like this. So thank you all for being here. Appreciate that very much. As you can see, we're joined by the family and they have a separate statement that they've given me permission to read. So it's wrapped up in all this. All right. So this is the statement of the family. Our family has been dealing with unimaginable pain since losing Stephen. We have been completely devastated and traumatized. Stephen did not have a weapon. We cannot understand how this could happen at the hands of police, the ones who are supposed to serve and protect us. It's been more than 2 years and we still do not have answers. The chief has never reached out to our family and just has stayed silent throughout it all. The EPS needs to be held accountable. Why does it take years for ACERT to do their investigations? It's impossible to have closure and heal when this is ongoing. We need change. We do not want another family to go through this tragedy. Stephen was very loved and he is missed. He deserves justice. We need justice for Stephen Nuet. Thank you, everyone.
I am the editor of the Progress Report. I'm an independent journalist here in Edmonton. I'm a member of the Canadian Association of Journalists, and you know, I followed the Stephen Nguyen case closely, and to be here to hear the statement from the family, to hear the details again, I mean, I think that's why events like this are important, to actually see what the cost of police misconduct, of police brutality is. And ever since 2020, ever since George Floyd was murdered by Minneapolis cops, one of my focuses as an independent journalist has been doing police accountability journalism. It's a lonely road. There's not a lot of journalists. There's not a lot of journalists, period. There are definitely not a lot of independent journalists, and then there are not a lot of independent journalists who take the time to report on police misconduct. And a lot of the stories that I have uncovered have been mentioned today. The EPS dumping bad cops with misconduct cases into schools as SROs. That was a story that I wrote. You know, the EPS having a secret plane that they didn't tell anyone about for 30 years, and that they were buying a new one. That was a story that I wrote about. Chief Dale McPhee going to a UCP fundraiser where UCP MLAs ran around in dinosaur costumes. You know, that was a story that I wrote about. And this kind of police accountability journalism is not only, like, you know, important to do, but it's also really hard to do. And one of the reasons why it's so hard to do is because the police actively frustrate it, and because the police accountability systems here and everywhere are broken. And as someone who covers police, tries to hold police accountable through journalism, I get a front row seat to just how poorly these systems function. And I'm happy to walk through a couple of examples. One thing that's been mentioned already, police discipline. Police do something, a complaint is made, investigation happens, eventually there's a police discipline hearing. Usually years down the road, but eventually there is. The names of the police officers or police officer are not released. All you get is a notice that a police discipline hearing is happening. So imagine you're an editor or a journalist, you know, you get the notification that something's happening. You have no idea who it is, you have no details of the case. You have to make a decision there to allocate scarce resources, your time or your reporter's time, to go, I'm gonna go to a hearing, I'm gonna burn a half a day. And is it a cop who shouldn't have written a jaywalking ticket, or is it a cop who, you know, murdered someone? You know, you don't know literally until you get there. And like, this is just again a small example of how the police accountability system is broken, but one that I think is kind of useful to bring up. I'll also just point out that as someone who goes to these EPS police disciplinary hearings, there hasn't been a police disciplinary hearing in the past 4 months. Not because EPS officers aren't doing things that require that are complained about, it's just there hasn't been. Like, imagine you're doing your job and you just took a third of the year off. That's what the EPS discipline process has done just over the past 4 months. Another way that even this EPS discipline process is just kind of managed and that it makes it hard to report on is that, say you don't go to the hearing. Months later, you'll get a written decision. Quite often, the name of the officer in question is redacted. The police the EPS make their own judgment call about whether or not to release the name of the police officer who has been disciplined. There's some filter they apply. What it is, they've never told anyone. They've certainly never told me. And so that is, again, the police disciplinary hearing process is just like irretrievably broken as a process of public oversight. Say you go to a police disciplinary hearing. Are you able to get an agreed statement of facts? No. Are you able to get the spelling of the name of the presiding officer? I've been denied that. Like this is there a video feed? Is there a recording of the matter? No, there is not. And again, that's just police discipline. That's like one little small part of the police kind of oversight, police accountability pie. But one thing that's been brought up a lot, Caspian's mentioned it, other folks have mentioned it, the police commission. This is ostensibly the body that's responsible for oversight. And it is also irretrievably broken. It is a clapping seal. It is an ally of the police force used to help increase its police budget and simply does not offer any meaningful oversight in any way. Again, an example, the last police commission meeting, Caspian was there. There was a very minor change that was proposed by a police commissioner where it was like, we'd like to change just a little simple thing about how these police use of force reports are presented. And this minor request threw a police commission meeting into a tizzy because apparently it hadn't been cleared. The police chair didn't know, everyone was looking around at each other, the CTO of the police force was called up, they were like, could you do this? Is this possible? They were like, yeah, it's pretty simple. It was then referred to, the chair of the meeting, the chair of the police commission then was like, hey, Chief McPhee, what should we do here? And the chief was like, well, you should probably send it back to committee. And it's like, again, the police commission is the body that is responsible for the oversight of the police. They are the body that hires and fires the chief. They are doing governance. To refer this, again, minor matter, to the police chief and then to just follow his orders is just a small example of how the police commission is just broken as a governance body. Also, fun fact, the police commission gave Chief Dale McPhee a very juicy 4-year contract extension just before the last municipal elections, guaranteeing that the new mayor and a whole brand new council, actually, majority new council, would have this police chief for the next 4 years, which I don't think was a very good decision. This is all to say that, and then, sorry, I got one more example, sorry. I got to get a little personal. These people, the police, have incredibly thin skin. I am accredited at the Court of King's Bench. I am accredited at the Court of Provincial Justice. I cover the provincial government. I go to City Hall. I am not hassled in any way. The only body that refuses to answer my questions is the Edmonton Police Service. Everywhere else, I send in media requests. They might not like it. They may delay it. They may give me a no comment. But they realize that, like, journalists serve a public good, and that answering questions, while maybe not the most favorite thing to do, is required. Only the EPS refuses to answer my questions, and it's not just me. I mean, they treat me very poorly, but any journalist that dares to not just rewrite their press releases or ask questions from, an approved list of questions that doesn't challenge power at all, they are treated incredibly harshly. Again, incredibly thin skin. They will wheedle, they will cajole, they will call your boss, they will try and get you in trouble. It is hard to kind of really put into words how just unused to pushback the institution of policing is. When even just like, again, I run a small 3-person independent media shop. The Edmonton Police have 20 full-time communications staff. It is not comparable really in any way. And I think those were the 3 kind of like examples I wanted to give of how the police make it harder to do police accountability journalism, how they make it harder to hold themselves accountable by these processes. And like, I'm again really grateful for Michael Jans and the filmmakers here and the families of Pacey Dumas and Stephen Nguyen to making themselves available, to having ourselves be a part of this, because putting a face to the damage done by the police. Again, I'm just one journalist. I haven't met you. I haven't met the family of Pacey Dumas before. This is important. This is an important work, and I'm really grateful.
I've been a police officer that was investigated for wrongdoing, and I've been a police officer trying to report wrongdoing by others. I've been a whistleblower working outside of a system that offers no protections to someone who wants to do the right thing. You see, municipal police officers in Alberta are specifically excluded from whistleblower protection laws, and globally, Canada is an embarrassment in that regard. In a 2021 study by the Government Accountability Project, Canada's whistleblower protection laws were ranked less effective and less comprehensive than almost every other country. We were ranked below Rwanda. We were ranked below Botswana. And we got to this point by neglecting to consider and cultivate the common principle upon which our community can be built. Justice is an individual contract that a person has with the government and their neighbors. It unifies right, left, rich, poor. We all want to feel safe in our surroundings. And we'd all agree that tyrannical behavior should be dealt with swiftly and effectively. Someone who preys on the weak and hurts members of our community should be arrested and punished. Whether they wear rags, a uniform, or a suit. Sadly, if you're the victim of a crime, you need to be capable of fighting within a system that doesn't reward the squeaky wheel or pushes for real change. With the current state of things, it would be dishonest to say that justice wouldn't cost you something. The last few years have been brutal for my family, but we wouldn't go back. Police officers who want to report real wrongdoing don't have a lot of options where their career and livelihood isn't at stake. They could reach out to someone like me or one of the many other police whistleblowers before taking action and maybe get some advice on how to remain anonymous, but that's really about it. Laws that offer protections to police whistleblowers in Alberta, or just the city of Edmonton, are important, but a long way from being a reality. We would get better witnesses. More police officers would be free to do the right thing. More opportunities for that unifying justice. More broadly, and without having to wait for a new law to be passed, each and every one of us needs to take responsibility for this problem. Drop the cynical attitude that it won't work or that the system is too broken. Be the good witness. Enter public service. Push the bureaucracy to work as intended. File those appeals. We have to have patience, courage, and above all, stamina.
If you could wave a wand, what rules, what laws would be changed tomorrow?
Well, I think that I believe very heartily in this idea of subsidiarity. I think that whether it's at the municipal level, which we do have control over, we could enact public interest disclosure laws that would protect whistleblowers, whether it's police or other city employees that are currently exempted in the provincial legislation, or add one line to the provincial legislation. It'd be very simple to include municipal employees because they're excluded today. Federally, again, if we were able to push for federal legislation that covers all government employees that want to bring forward wrongdoing and be good witnesses, but offer them protections so that reprisals don't occur for those whistleblowers, I know they would make a big difference.
Tom or Chad or anyone else, any questions?
Don't think I can talk to him.
Oh, right,
He's
sorry.
prohibited.
Right, Chad.
The chief prohibited him.
Chad or Dan, any questions?
Yeah, Chad, I was RCMP for 17 and then
now a defense lawyer down in Calgary.
Pleasure.
Can you talk a little bit about your experience, what the culture was like when you tried to bring, I mean, it's difficult for people that aren't in a police organization to truly understand the weight that comes down on you when you try to stand up and do the right thing. Can you maybe talk a little bit about that and what that's like, how you're dissuaded?
Yeah, well, I think it's different for everyone. I think when you report wrongdoing in a police organization, you don't really expect the immune response that you get, and that's exactly it. You're treated like a disease in the system, and it's something that, whether you expect it or not, whether you see the value in bringing forward that wrongdoing to try and fix it, it doesn't match everything else that you do on a daily basis. You're there to catch bad guys. What does it matter if it's a guy wearing a uniform? But it hurts, and it alienates you. You get the white blood cells circling around, and it doesn't feel as expected when you know that you belong. It's like a brotherhood, brothers and sisters doing sometimes doing wrong and just need to be held accountable.
Dan talked about it a little bit when he spoke, and I talked about it a little bit when I spoke about the need for change within policing organizations. Dan's comment was that it needs to change from the top down and the bottom up, which seems to be all of it.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on how the internal mechanism of policing can change or should change?
I think it comes down to the principles. I mean, we've lost track of that, and I know I'm not just trying to say generally as police officers. I mean, as a society, I think everyone can look around and realize that it's not working as intended, and we all have a responsibility to that. And that sometimes we do give into that cynicism, like I was just saying, is that we think, yeah, it's not going to work. What's the point? They're so big and I'm so small. But if you don't try it, if you don't make them do what's wrong because you expect them to, because you are just going to give up on their behalf, then it will never get fixed. You can't surrender before trying, and that's the way we have all been behaving.
Can I make a comment?
Yeah.
Or a question? I don't want to go into the details of the whistleblowing stuff that you went on, but I want to say there was a power differential, and policing being a microcosm of society. I just want to know if you can comment on when you are the person without the power trying to take a person with power, make a person with power accountable, how that worked for you and how that necessarily works in society.
I think the first response is denial, right? Everyone you talk to is like, well, no, it couldn't possibly be true. You must be seeing it wrong, and that's the way it happens for everyone, because that bias is brought into it. That's why we have to rely on the system so much, because if the system operating as intended is indeed blind, then yeah, we'll see justice. That's great. But as soon as we have individuals that give into that bias, thinking, again, someone who's in a position of power, who is like in a police organization, guy's wearing a white shirt, he must have been through a lot, he must have seen everything, and he's of course reliable. We all rely on him. It's just one example.
So and for those that don't know, a white shirt in policing is upper ranks. So they're in management, they're overseeing the organization, and lower ranks. That's just jargon that people might not be familiar with. So
yeah,
sorry to interrupt you.
No, not at all. Yeah. So the thanks. Sometimes I don't realize when I still use the jargon. But yeah, someone in a position of power who's in the upper ranks, the bias is understandably towards making sure that no, we have to see all facets of this first. And sometimes that leads us to make excuses where they ought not to be made.
Dan, can you speak to, so you were a whistleblower. A whistleblower has a union, a very strong union. Does the union side with whistleblowers, or what could you speak to that dynamic too? Or generally even?
Yeah, that it wasn't my experience. No. A public sector union has a very difficult hand-in-glove relationship with the organization that pays it, to be upfront about it. So I think it's difficult to expect a public sector union, especially when we're talking about public sector, to ever seek an individual's interest as opposed to a group's interest. And the group's interest is to make sure the system doesn't change.
But the union often says when there's bad apples, they have to represent them. They say, oh, it's our job. We have to stand. They're our members. We've got to represent them. So how is that decision made? Who they represent or who they don't?
I wish I knew. I wish I knew how the decision is made, but to say, I think any observer can recognize that a selective application of the law is no law at all. So if we do have an individual interest, yeah, it doesn't matter if it's distasteful to protect someone who deserves or has a right to representation from a union. It might be distasteful, but we have to. Great, apply that across the board, and we can see that it isn't.
So, I have a question. They took your pay away in November of 2021, and they have prevented you from working since then. How would you tell other people to weather that?
Well, for any whistleblower coming forward, it doesn't matter if it's a police officer or not, I think you have to have a plan, go into it with open eyes, research it, make sure that you have good advice where you can get it. Because the system itself is, it does have a lot of advantages the way it's set up today.
Hi everyone, my name is Shima Robinson. I am born and raised in Amisquachi-Waskagan, aka Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. Treaty 6. Lots of stories to tell. First things first, I will focus on the couple parts of the story of my journey through advocacy, specifically about the better treatment, upliftment, provision of services and supports, and recognition for the systemic injustices that face vulnerable people, equity-seeking communities, and that those things that threaten the legitimacy of our democracy, the legitimacy of our society, the efficacy of our efforts to maintain accountability and the morale of the electorate, the people of the city, and those who are not considered part of the electorate but who also reside here. So summer of 2020 was a big one. I was heavily involved with Black Lives Matter YUG for years prior. From 2016 to August of last year, I was a member of Black Lives Matter YUG. And in the summer of 2020, which was the summer that George Floyd was murdered, we launched a huge mobilization effort to have a protest at the legislative grounds here in Amisquachi-Waskagan, and that effort focused a lot on critiques of police conduct, critiques of the police budget, and the defund the police movement. That movement is international. The protest itself was one of many protests that happened all over the world, that was definitely spurred along by a domino effect of protests happening all over the region of, all over, from Calgary was the most immediate one. They did an event, they did a protest, and we got an order to do something in Edmonton. Now, I found there were two impetuses for that. One was to show that yes, we recognize, understand, and would seek to redress the harms done by police activities in our city, specifically those harms done to the equity-seeking communities that identify as quote-unquote Black. Of course, this term is not sufficient to describe the great diversity of people of African descent who live and work in and exist and thrive and have leisure and try to seek betterment of their families, their communities, and themselves in this city. But that was the rallying cry. The rallying cry was Black Lives Matter, a rhetorical term that allows us to consider whether or not we consider that. That protest was 15,000 people strong. It was a collective effort of a lot of different people to bring that together. And our focus during the protest and after the protest through letter campaigns that were organized collaboratively with multiple organizations was to bring the issue of police accountability to the forefront, to highlight the critical mass of people who felt it necessary, important, and right to speak up about the treatment of peoples considered under the moniker of Black, all over the city, all over the province, all over the Western Canadian region, and everywhere else in the country. To speak up in solidarity with the family of George Floyd, with George Floyd himself, and with the ongoing struggles for justice that were happening in the United States of America and across the world at that time. It is incredibly crucial to note that the gains in the level of conversation that were happening at that time, that continue to happen, are huge. The issues raised by the inception and subsequent propagation of Black Lives Matter movements all over the world were now dinner time conversation for the entire city. That level of discourse is, I think, part of the accountability process. It's raising these special interest issues up from the level of special interest to the level of a general public concern. That was a major win of that particular effort, and that, I think, is the thing that I uphold most as the most effective result of that protest. It's important that these conversations persist. If they don't persist on an everyday basis, if they don't persist in all areas of our society, they are reduced to, again, the level of special interest, the level of gripers, the level of people who have critical takes, hot takes. These aren't hot takes we're describing. They are actually calls for justice. They are calls for accountability, for the attention to equity and systemic arrangements in our city and beyond, in our province and beyond. So I'm thrilled to be speaking on it today. I have noted that those conversations that follow the massive mobilizations that are perfectly possible and absolutely vital to the survival of our voices as citizens, as consequential, not just present, but consequential. Those mobilizations give rise to more mobilizations. This is a mobilization. We have lots of capacity to do this work collectively. The next mobilization that I was a part of was Pequawin encampment, which happened also in the summer of 2020. 100 days of encampment, the existence of that encampment as a functionally police-free zone was what was accomplished at Pequawin Camp. Pequawin Camp started as 4 service tents, a teepee that was raised by a now transformed and I guess some would say, well, I guess defunct group called Beaver Hills Warriors, who connected the effort of many social service or human service worker who was seeing the frontline effects of the negligence, the victimization, the criminalization of poverty, all of those things that cause the prevalence of statistics, overrepresentation of Indigenous people in the prisons, overrepresentation of Indigenous people in various other types of human service organizations, the child and family services, all those things, the apprehension of Indigenous children from their families. These things were at the forefront of our discourse, our conversations, as we were coming together to basically create some kind of malleable, responsive, nimble approach, diversity of tactics forefront of our minds at the time. We're like, how can we raise awareness of this particular egregious negligence being displayed by the city of Edmonton as an organization toward people who are criminalized for being poor, who are criminalized for reasons of racialization that we're staunchly against. What was happening, for context, in that summer was it was the height of pandemic restriction era, and people who were accessing services at Boyle Street, community services, or who were accessing any of the other adjacent or parallel services in the city were being locked out of those services. Doors were closing. Okay, doors were closing shut tight. No meal services, no medical services, no social work, nothing. Then the city opened day shelter and night shelter for people in this particular situation, the people who are unhoused between residences, who did not have a permanent place to stay, people who were battling addictions, people who were dealing with the attendant problems of being criminalized because of racialization and poverty. Those two shelters, day and night shelter, were on opposite ends of the city practically. We had Northlands and we had Kinsman. The commute to get from one place to the other place was absolutely debilitating to people. That made those services available in those areas completely futile for people who didn't have high mobility, for people who didn't trust those services, for people who had addiction issues that were too severe to make those daily plans to commute from one place to the other place. And even arrival at those places did not guarantee safety, did not guarantee support, and certainly did not guarantee a conduit to reasonable supportive safety type situations. So some weeks into that plan that the city had made, after critiques were leveled at them for not presenting some kind of contingency that was more functional, they shut down the day services. The day they shut down day services, I was speaking to a couple of the people I knew who were doing the service work at the time, and they said they had 2 weeks notice, given only to workers, not to the community members who they were serving. So people would arrive at day shelter and not get in and be informed that it was closed permanently. Then Peculiar Camp came along as this 4-tent, 1 TP initiative. Peculiar Camp was initially a place advertised to get a hot meal and a place to pitch a tent. Everything that followed from there was a result of the intensely devoted advocacy, action, donations from the public, everybody getting on the ground in that piece of land, which was only maintainable as the piece of land that was a police-free zone because it is crown land there. We set up at 4 a.m. By noon, the police were at the site. They were told to leave. There was a reasonable expectation that they would leave. They did leave. More people came to help support than were living on the site on that first day first day to 5 days into that encampment. Then the word got around. Word of mouth travels faster than any form of media you can even describe. So the word of mouth traveled, people came down to pitch a tent, to have a place to just stay. One of the things that I'd like to highlight about that is not that, is rather that it is about being able to have rest. People came to that site not because they knew they were going to get a meal, not because they knew they were going to get supports and services or conduit to housing or conduit to medical care, which all happened on that site. They came to that site because they were able to pitch a tent and go to sleep. Police in this city disrupts the rest, the necessary human need to just sleep for everybody who's criminalized in this city. And I'm getting emotional now because I know what it's like to be in that situation. Okay? I know what it's like to not have a place to sleep in the public on the commons of the city we call home. And that is a travesty when you consider how vital it is for someone to just take a breath when they're in that situation. There is a matrix of things to navigate in the service sector when you run into the situation where you have no home, and where you have nowhere to go, and where you have no money, and you have attendant mental health issues and addictions issues that come from that. Policing in the city does not regard that circumstance as a crisis for the person going through it. They regard that circumstance as an inconvenience for the citizenry that owns private property, that drives cars, that has a regular income, that has an address and a phone. And it's absolutely, absolutely unfathomable for me and for many of us, all of us, I believe, on this bus, to think about that as being a proper standard of serving and protecting the city. Now, there is a common sort of perspective that the police protect and serve, or the police are supposed to protect and serve, and I want to wake us all up to the fact that the police service as a service in the city protects private property and not the people. That is a fact. That persists. That is the whole concept of policing to a T in a nutshell. Now, if we want policing in the city to serve the people, it's going to take massive reform of the way we envision our own roles and the roles of police in the maintenance of safety in this city. We can do a lot more than we are able to do right now in future if we seize upon the real opportunity to advocate, demand, and actively do the things that keep us safe. We keep us safe. We keep us safe. Police respond to violent incidents. We keep us safe in a way where we prevent violence from happening interpersonally, institutionally, okay, ideologically. That's in our power. That's what Pecuewan Camp was about. It was volunteer run. It was supported by donations completely. There was no sponsor, no overarching organization, none of that. There was a bunch of individuals who got together with their collective knowledge, know-how, sense of justice, and just got on the ground and worked on it. Day one, by noon to 1:30, they asked me to be the media liaison of Pecuewan Camp. I said yes. And I said yes because no one else had capacity. It wasn't like I was like, yeah, that sounds like a great opportunity. I was like, no, I have capacity. I have the skills. I can speak off the top of my head quite well, and I understand the issues. Now that is a position of privilege. That's not a position of good fortune. It's not a position of opportunity. It's a position of privilege. And so I took my privilege and put it to work. Now, dealing with the media, I got a sense of what the status quo perception of Pecuewan Camp was. The status quo says Pecuewan Camp was full of menacing people, full of people who live in dereliction, people who don't respect the private property of the neighborhood or the neighbors surrounding them in that neighborhood. Pecuewan Camp was alternately a very peaceful place. Some afternoons, quiet, calm, leaves are falling, everything's chill, people are content as they could possibly be. In other circumstances, hyper-violence. In other circumstances, high tension. But we managed to keep each other incredibly safe. We managed to do 100 days of encampment without police presence, except for on the edges of that encampment, and which was always in a sense of disturbance, always in a sense of the tactical team coming down to do whatever they were doing, always just like this battle of like, you have to stay out of this area. This area is being maintained as a place that is safe from police brutality. The reality of that is not something to take lightly. The reality of that is that we managed to keep a 400-person encampment as safe as it could possibly be. They voluntarily walked onto that site and stayed, despite the fact that there were only 7 porta potties for 400 people. Despite the fact that there was always a threat of being raided. Despite the fact that there was always just need after need after need that we're trying to meet through service tents established by organizations like Homeward Trust. The community paramedics team would come in with their trucks and help people with open wounds. We had all of that set up, and we had it all set up because of the will of people who got there on the first day and said, you know what, this is unjust. You know, they closed night shelter shortly after they closed day shelter, and that's why we had that many people on that site. Now, that site, we took it, we went toe-to-toe with the city, and we went toe-to-toe with the cops, and we said, we're going to keep developing this site until you have a contingency plan for shelter in the winter, because we were doing overdose response on a massive scale. The cops weren't, we don't even know if they were carrying naloxone at the time. They're supposed to be dealing with crises in the streets. What the unspoken thing is that they're eradicating evidence of crisis in the streets, and that evidence is the people. So on a statistical level, we had 1 death on Pekiwewin site. 400 people who were there for at least the last 60 days of the site's existence. 1 death. A single death. So when I say we keep each other safe, when I say we keep us safe, I really do mean it. Okay, because how many deaths in the streets from overdose, from drug poisoning are there right now? The cops aren't able or equipped or interested in doing anything about that. We made ourselves able, equipped, and ready in like a week to deal with all of that at Pekiwewin camp. And advocacy was not just me on the mic with the cameras going. It was everybody in the organizing community who sat down with me every day and spoke their piece about what needed to be known. Okay, it wasn't a solo mission. It was every single person I had a connection with being like, this is what needs to be known about this. This is how we're gonna get this done. We brought in as much support as we could for people. People were housed out of Pekiwewin camp. People were supported medically. People got IDs out of Pekiwewin camp. All the services. It's the will to do it. It's the will to cut out all the bureaucratic BS and figure out how to just do it. And people did that, not cops. So when it comes down to accountability, I have 2 things that I really want to focus on personally in terms of policing and the police, etc. One of those things is the budget. I'm concerned for the size of the police budget in reference to the amount of results we see from this notion of serving and protecting. It's absolute nonsense. It's nonsense. Most people I know on the street who have street adjacency regard the cops as a threat, not as a service. That has to be acknowledged. And the next thing is we download our sense of responsibility for public safety onto the police. We do this every day. And it's not because we are willfully negligent. It's because most of the time, social infrastructurally, there is no other option for high crisis moments. We have to call the police. That's not a choice. That's coercion. So I think a great deal of focus needs to be pulled from the lessons learned from Pekiwewin, pulled from the lessons learned from the Black Lives Matter protests or the Fight for Equity protests, however it's known to you, and applied to our activities, the way we come together, our coalitions, our community-based organizations, everything that we do as community members, because we are all community members, to keeping us safe, okay? Because at the end of the day, the bottom line will eventually say, well, the cops didn't do much this year. And that's one foothold in the long climb to the top of the cliff that we haven't ever seen the top of in our society, okay? We've never seen the top of that cliff. Policing is an institution older than the country. So what I want to see is more discussion, the discourse to grow. What I want to see is for us to understand that there are options for reforming the police force, but there's also, or the police service as they're called, but there's also way more options about interconnectivity, understanding our own role with each other's safety, understanding how to advocate for one another in moments of crisis, and understanding when to just pick someone up, helping hand, less judgment, more action, and then documenting that somehow. And any level of documentation will serve, honestly. Any level of documentation for that kind of exigence as the electorate, as the community, as the people will serve. And I think that that is a way forward. That is a way to justify our own capacity, and that is a way to answer that horrible question of, well, if the police don't do it, who's gonna? Because what they're doing is not what we want to see. Thank you very much.